Guildhall. Значит, Мария Разумовская, она профессор Guildhall School of Music. И, конечно, для меня очень... Я всегда своим студентам говорю, надо быть исполнителями, чтобы быть хорошими учеными. Хотя сама я совершенно бросила играть, но по другой причине. Поэтому, как про вас написали, виртуозо, storyteller and piano, да? Это, я считаю, что будущее вообще и исполнительства, и научных работ многих, когда человек может донести, исполняя концерт, донести какие-то знания и историю с этим вместе. Сегодня у вас очень интересная тема, да? Звучание салона. Я даже до того, как я поняла, где я буду chair, да, я посмотрела на программу и подумала, вот эту презентацию надо послушать. Так что я с нетерпением жду вас. Вот так. Спасибо.
Спасибо большое. Thank you very much. For the sake of John and Zoe, I will stick to English. Но я, естественно, могу переводить на русский язык. Я думаю, не имеет смысла на двух языках параллельно
А
вести.
кому нужно переводить? Лене, да? Лена вам тоже говорит прекрасно английский. Так что спокойно вперед на английском языке.
Okay.
Да.
So I will do this paper in English. Thank you very much for the really warm welcome. And I'm really interested to try and find a way in recent projects of trying to bridge what is sometimes a quite artificial gap between performance and the musicology that I keep finding myself up against in an environment like Guildhall, which is very heavily performance orientated, but yet we have a research department. And the question always comes up, what's the point? How can you unite these two disciplines? And the focus of my recent research has been the pianist Maria Yudina, and specifically the reason she's interested me is because I've been somewhat frustrated actually in terms of the performance practice related musicology, that what we tend to be trying to discuss are general trends. So we're looking at epochs and trying to decide what performers are doing as a group. It seems to be much easier to manage in many ways. It gives us nice patterns. But I know as a performer that actually it's very rare to find a regimented set of colleagues around you. And it's the eccentricities or the seeming eccentricities that for me will narrate far more about the spirit of an epoch, because it cuts through that global trend to really tell us about the small happenings that had the significance. And this is why the Salon becomes important. Maria Yudina did not have a prolific concert career for especially political reasons in the Soviet Union, and most of her music making was done, we could say in inverted commas, underground, so in quasi-salons. So a lot of the documentation of the research about how she actually performed doesn't really come to us from recordings. And for someone like me who's never obviously heard her playing, I have no bridge to that epoch. But I do have, or I did have, materials related to her writing about the music, which you could say is impossible to prove what she did. But I also have marked scores, and those marked scores, together with her writings, start to give me a little bit of an insight, not into how exactly she played, which for me is not really what I'm interested in, but how she thought about the hierarchies that supported her playing. Because as a performer, we very rarely, I think, try to play in exactly the same way over and over again. So it's a kind of fake chase to try and work out exactly what a performer tries to do on stage. What does stay the same for performances, though, over a relative period of time in a lifetime, is an interpretation. It's the values and the aesthetics that that performer will hold dear, and that will produce that kind of caliber of interpretation that becomes distinct. We don't value a performer by one performance of a sonata, by one performance of a nocturne. We value a performer's output by that overall span of what they're producing, and that has to be governed by a much larger hierarchical system than individual tiny brushstrokes. So in today's presentation, I'm going to be looking at how the two, in my mind, come together and what they can show us about the really specific atmosphere that was created around Yudina and her followers. So for those people who aren't familiar with the name Maria Yudina, I'm going to be talking about a pianist who had a formidable reputation here, looking very austere. She was born in Imperial Russia in 1899. She died in 1970. She was known for her eccentric manners on the stage. Somebody like Sviatoslav Richter would always introduce her in his own writings internationally. She never traveled internationally, but he would introduce her internationally as one of those strange pianists you want to avoid, because she would come onto the stage, find the grand piano, and invariably take a black handbag and slam it onto the piano lid. And then the first thing she would do is she would talk to the conductor and say, "Darling, here, hold my revolver. Be careful, it's loaded." So these kinds of stories pass down very amusingly into the legends surrounding Yudina. People like Shostakovich, and through the lenses of Volkov in Testament, we also have bits of information again contributing to this legend of an absolute eccentric who was on the very perimeters of concert life. And we know from Shostakovich's or Volkov's ideas of testimony that there was a lot of friction there as well, that there was not so much friendship, there was quite a lot of suspicion about how her manners, in especially being very open about being religious on stage, so crossing herself just before she sat down at the piano, just before she bowed, wearing nun-like outfits, and preferably encouraging people to donate their money not to the concerts but to the church. Shostakovich said, well, that's absolute madness, especially when everybody knew that she was living in poverty and had cracked windows in the Moscow winters. So we've got this layers of many, many legends around her, probably none the more famous, of course, than the legend that she is somehow linked with the death of Stalin. And just to show you the trailer of the film, so that I don't have to retell the story. Sorry, I didn't share my computer sound. I'll try that one more time. Her main fame for most people, especially in the West, comes from this idea that her recording was powerful enough to kill the evil dictator. Sorry, I'm having a bit of trouble sharing the screen. I'll try one more time.
Shouldn't we check it?
Is that working? Can you see a YouTube video?
No time. If it's not okay, then Stalin's men will chop you into dog meat. Thank you.
Move, 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 move. Excuse me. Thank you.
I have it. I have it. I have the recording. I just had to get a new sleeve. A white one.
The delay has been logged.
I wish to convey a special message from my heart.
I wish to convey this recording to Comrade Stalin.
I want Comrade Stalin to know the full intensity of my feelings for him.
No, this is unauthorized narcissism.
No. The item is now in my possession after a significant delay. Note the time.
What took you so long? You fucking walk here?
The world is in chaos.
And basically he puts on the recording of a hastily made Mozart Concerto No. 24, and the next sequence of the film is that Stalin chokes and dies. What he reads from the LP cover is the very famous, infamous note that Yudina wrote allegedly to Stalin, in which she said, apparently, that I thank you, Joseph Vissarionovich, for your aid. I will pray for you day and night and ask the Lord to forgive your great sins before the people and the country. The Lord is merciful and will forgive you. I gave the money, for the recording, 20,000 rubles for the church that I attend. So, of course, there is a lot of skepticism about whether this note was ever put into that LP, but there is also a lot of people who do believe that this was the last thing to be played on his LP record player before he died. So lots of layers that actually, for me as a performer, give me absolutely no information about Yudina as an artistic force. And she has an artistic force. Strong following in the musical societies and the musical audiences, but because of how deep she was connected with the philosophical and poetic literary circles, the intelligentsia of the time. So we're obviously actually dealing with a really sharp, really intelligent musician who, for various reasons, has got fame for everything else seemingly other than her playing. So the playing is labeled eccentric, something of a madman. We know that, again, musicians such as Richter has said, the only thing you can get from her playing is a headache. What I'm going to show you today is actually there's a lot of logic behind what she did, and possibly what we are missing behind being blinded by all these myths is the sense that actually a lot of these traditions about how you built up musical structure are actually performance practices that didn't need to be documented. They were so obvious to musicians of the time that there wasn't a need to have them documented. And Bella mentioned in the casual conversation that, of course, Rachmaninoff anniversary is coming up next year. And this is another place where, for example, what Rachmaninoff might have not written into a score with the tempo directions, you can see the same things. Yudina doesn't necessarily feel perhaps that she needs to be explaining this explicitly until the end of her life, when she feels that those performance traditions are disappearing and she decides that she is going to actually write in the Salon a set of lectures about the performance and her aesthetics and what she wants to do with the music, and also set it down literally onto a score. So something she probably wouldn't have done, but performance practice was changing, and for some reason something provoked her to do something different. So I'm going to be focusing on her last lecture because of the material that's been available for me in the current situation, and that was on Mussorgsky's pictures at an exhibition. What is really unique about her interpretation and her vision of Mussorgsky at an exhibition is the care she places into choosing the vocabulary to describe it. So amongst musicians, it's very commonly taken as a tapestry of different images. And you see very frequently it being described actually not as a cycle, but as a suite, a collection of things that are put together. And she, in her lecture that she gave in the Salon, her underground salon, basically one of the lower rooms in the Moscow Conservatoire, she spent a lot of time to explain that it should not be seen as a suite, that it has to be seen with the different word cycle. And for her, she says, in the whole of the musical literature, there have not been many cycles. And it's very revealing what kinds of cycles she is bringing to mind. The first one that she brings to mind immediately is St. Matthew's Passion. She says that is musically the first cycle that should be of great importance. And it chimes with her religious ideology and her need to feel a religious connection through her repertoire, on the one hand. On the other hand, she says the other great cycle, in between which the Mussorgsky pictures at an exhibition sits, is the Messiaen 20 Regards, so the 24 images of the infant Jesus. So she's placing two cycles, which she considers to be prototypes or related types to pictures at an exhibition. According to her, and this is perhaps her eccentricity, very little other music fits that definition of a cycle. And that for me becomes intriguing because for me, in terms of repertoire, I start stringing off a whole load of other pieces that she's actually excluded from calling as a cycle. So the obvious connection seems to be the religious connection in this case. And that chimes really well with the way that she is presented in the mythology as well of her as being totally committed to preaching from the stage rather than performing from the stage. But I wonder actually what that sense of religious connection gives her. And what is interesting to see is when she talks about it as a cycle, she doesn't necessarily want you to be giving equal attention to certain pieces. So within that cycle, she straight away dismisses a couple of pieces, such as this one, the Garden of Tweed. For her, it's an insignificant resting point in this cycle. So she's not interested in trying to produce a connection there. But other pieces, she spends a lot of time trying to explain and notate through the scores about how they come together to create what she calls a liquid architecture. So this definition for her, liquid architecture, is very unique kind of vocabulary that she feels for some reason she cannot attribute to other pieces that I would, for example, consider a cycle. So, I mean, I was thinking straight away of something like Winterreise. She loves Schubert. She doesn't give the word cycle to Winterreise in her lectures. She calls it a collection, not a cycle. So to call a work a cycle for her means that what she's looking for, according to her markings, according to her writing, is an integrity in the line and the way that it's composed. And what is really astounding for me is that the degree to which she's prepared to go against what seems to be the marking in the score, or what seems to be a tradition in the performance of the score, to make sure everything fits into the triptych that she's going to set up through this piece of music. So the first, I'm going to leave the promenades for a second. She describes them as chorales. I think the connection of the chorales or the promenades is more obvious. So I'm going to look at the other connections she's making instead. So she takes the first piece, the gnomus, as the basis to produce this architecture. And it's quite interesting what she says, because she says it's not only the folk element and this fairy tale nightmare element that we have to give through this troll-like creature. What is worse, what is more painful to play, what is more significant to find through the interpretation is that actually this is the destroyed personality of the human, the destroyed Lichnost of the human. And she says it's not destroyed because it's a fundamentally bad Lichnost persona. It's a destruction of something that was inherently good. So in terms of course, a biblical parallel, you could be thinking of the Garden of Eden here. And for her, because this is the beginning of the cycle, you can see she's going to be setting up this biblical curve. This moment here with the gnome, is one that's going to lead her interpretation. So she's concerned to make sure that there's no humor. This is going to be a very dark, but at the same time, it's going to have something that you will have to feel sorry for. And this idea of feeling sorry because it's not completely bad at the core is something that forms the whole architecture for her of this cycle. So how does she do that? Well, she plays the gnome remarkably slowly. So normally you would hear something like... So that would be a quite usual concert tempo, not only today, but actually even throughout the 20th century through the recordings we have that come from Russian pianists or Russian-speaking trained pianists. What Yudina does, and this is where the eccentricities come in, both in her recording and in her marked score, she actually asks for a really slow tempo, which for me, it's not my concept of this piece. You know, every bone in my body actually doesn't want to play it at this speed, but... And then she'll go on with this speed. So it's a much much, much slower speeds than you would probably be hearing in a concert hall. One that makes it remarkably hard to sustain the line, of course. And you're thinking, why would a pianist necessarily put such direct challenges into their path? I mean, it's the most unpianistic way to already play a piece that is pretty unpianistic in itself. And for me, that reason starts to become clear when she starts to create that arch, the architecture through which she defines this word cycle. So going on from the tradition of her classmates and her recent colleagues at the time, thinking someone like Rachmaninoff, we know that tempo was something that they were incredibly sensitive to. And I said, it's an unwritten thing that you make tempo connections through the piece in a way that is far more disciplined than I think many performers would be able to do today. The sense of being able to, over a long period of time, in this case 40 minutes nearly, sustain that pulse of that initial architecture and link it into something that happens later, about a third of the way through, and then the last third of the way through, and to make sure it lines up into that absolute same sense. The tempo starts to cross over with the sense of architecture in terms of the narrative she's portraying too. So the slow tempo here, the next piece she connects the gnome to is Guildhall, the ox cart. Now this one is marked in the score as pesante, whereas the other one is marked allegretto. So I mean allegretto possibly, but hers is very, very slow. She takes exactly the same speed, the Guildhall. Absolutely linked with that same. So she's taking you through the piece of music and her thoughts that in terms of the architecture, they are linked in terms of the programmatic imagery, the emotional intensity. In her descriptions, this is the next piece with which she uses those same biblical, perhaps, connections. So she says in her lecture notes, and she marks in her margin notes for some of her students, that the greatest connection that she can make with this point here is to be making it with the sense of Mussorgsky's Paris Godunov. And she says that there's a sense that straight away, as soon as you hear this ox-drawn cart, what you're hearing is the same thing as in the opera Boris Godunov. And that is a warm sympathy and a respect for the figure that you see in front of you. In terms of the choice of words, I've actually yet to find many musicians who would describe the opening of Guildhall as something that hits the audience with a warm sense of sympathy. For me, in my mind, it completely seems to be the opposite of what I'd assume looking at the score, but also knowing from the canon and even the image of the ox. And for me, it's a really cold work. But yet, she's emphasizing that it has to hit the audience with a warm sympathy and respect. She then goes on straight away to say, why is it that Tsar Boris is a murderer, a cold-blooded murderer of an innocent child? And you can see now the connection with the gnome. This sense of sin becomes inherent in the architecture of this piece. A fallen hero, a hero with a flaw, but a hero in that literary sense where there is something there that is not deeply rotten to the core for some reason. So this sense of redemption becomes an important feature in how she sets up the cycle, and again fits in with the religious imagery that she's both known for, but also is choosing to evoke in these sessions here. And she does this warmth really remarkably in the end, where Mussorgsky fragments the texture. So his cart disappears into the distance, and what he asks for is to have really non-legato articulation, so that it seems like these cart wheels, I guess, are rolling over into the distance. And most of the time you're going to hear performances that have a very separated left hand. And what she does instead is she wraps it in this really strong veil of lyricism. It becomes a very human voice at the end. So something that actually is traditionally through the canon of performance treated as a really cold subject, disappearing off grudgingly into the distance, holding, you know, all the heavy burdens and rumbling off. For her, suddenly becomes covered with this veil of like a mist of some kind of positive lyrical sound. She used a lot of rubato here. She marks in her score to really she waits a long time for this last one. Nothing inhuman about it. And she says that the next promenade, so basically the next chorale, the next promenade, for her, it's a continuation. And that, again, is very unusual because Mussorgsky writes here specifically a double bar line with a fermata. So he's very specific which movements he wants attacca and which ones he actually physically puts the fermata in. Double bar line, he's assuming there's going to be space, I would say, between the Biddle and then the promenade. And yet she says that you cannot take time there because it wouldn't reflect the right spirit of the line, of the architecture. So she completely ignores Mussorgsky's marking, which is to have that double bar line with the pause, because that lyricism of the end, for her, melts into the upcoming promenade. So as a context, the most usual speed for this promenade would be something around twice time difference compared to what is the sort of the generic norm and what she's allowing herself to do. But behind it, there is a stern logic, nevertheless. It's a very personal, very subjective logic, but it isn't the eccentricity of an unfounded decision. So throughout that first opening, she's already connected two very big pieces. She's not a fan of this one. She says it's all self-explanatory, so I'm assuming for her it doesn't fit into her architecture, so she doesn't feel the need that it needs to have anything said about it other than it's a bit of light relief. That then plunges you straight forward into her next important bit of the architecture. And of course for her the next important, significant moment that's coming up is the two Jews, the rich and the poor. And here, again, she highlights the need for the echo of the sound and the timbre of the sound to hark back to the gnome. So the gnomos and the rich and poor Jew, for her, in this textural sound qualities, need to have a match. So her articulation there is particularly harsh. It lacks that kind of velvet sound that's traditionally, if you look at lots and lots of program notes, both throughout the Soviet Union, after the Soviet Union, the sense of grandeur and majesty is missing from her interpretation. It's brittle, like that opening gnome. She matches that semi-staccato touch. And immediately it makes this quite repulsive sounding at the beginning. So she's not saving the moment that sort of hits you emotionally for this bit. The second theme, the poor Jew, she links much more closely to that closing sound of that promenade. She uses the same kind of lyrical again, lots of rubato in space. So moving away from the canonic idea, again, there's a very strong line that she's using, an inherent line of the architecture to create the cycle there. The market of Le Monge for her, she says, yes, it's a market, but it's not the market of France as such. She says, you've got to remember that this is Jesus Christ telling the people to leave the temple because they've been using the Father's house to engage in trade rather than in worship. So for her, there's a sharp sense of irony in something that has to have that same sound as the gnome, this idea of sin, and then the chasing away. Matches, again, in speed to what she does with the gnome. The same trajectory overall in the whole piece of going from this to then exactly twice as fast for the end is what she did for the gnome. This sense that what has happened is now twice as fast relationship. There's still a connection there, but there's an agitation, there's a change of energy, and the change in mood almost from something that's got this sin, and then when she's trying to bring this idea of leaving sin, she always, for some reason, puts the tempo up exactly twice, so this kind of elevation. So she sees actually this as a very positive transformation of the song happening at that point, and she says it finds its peace in the catacombs. What she does is she mixes the two sound qualities together. First, she starts with that lyrical idea of redemption, and she interlaces it, despite the huge legato marks within the score, with a really sharp, very percussive, almost Bartok-like attack on places that don't have accents. So, for instance, she will play. And leave the left hand off. And then next cycle of the music, she brings back that evocative quality of redemption. And then immediately, again, that sharp disjointed. Mix between really following bits of the legato, bits of the accents, but with something that is absolutely choreographed to match her own vision of the individual techniques and architectures that she's been building up to that point. The Baba Yaga for her is the next big pivotal phase that happens. And here you're actually hearing the journey in reverse. And she does this quite often. She sets up a series of temporal relationships or a series of characters. And then towards the end of the piece, she does this very often in Schubert, she inverts what she has done. So, of course, she's not arguing with the idea of evil and terror in the beginning. She matches the tempo back to the known. Tempo up in the next phrase twice as fast. So there's a disconnect, actually, even on the first page, between two tempos that should, according to the score, be the same. And so, straight away for me, the question is, why would you do that? Why would you change halfway through a page your tempo marking? There is nothing to suggest that this should suddenly be twice as fast as your beginning octaves. And where she reveals her answer for why she's doing this, why she feels she's authorized to make this kind of disjunct in the tempo, is her interpretation of that middle section. If we know Hartmann's pictures that go together or have apparently inspired the cycle, the middle section of Baba Yaga is a clock. And there's something very inhuman, mechanical, of course, in that ticking of that clock underneath. And this is how, again, it's a very common way to hear the piece. Very, very mechanical inside, texture, punctuated, as Mussorgsky asks, with accents. What does she do? She actually says, this is not a clock. Well, she doesn't even say it's a clock. She says, this is a moment which is like a Lorelei moment. This is the distillation of all humanity's sin. For her, the evil and sin of humanity is all condensed into this Andante mosso section. And this is why the temporal relationships for her start to invert. So if redemption is going twice as fast to descend down into sin, she is taking down the tempo exactly twice. Hence why she had to speed up so that now she can let the tempo sit. And she says it has to be alluring. It's got to be the most lyrical and persuasive because we all fall into sin without realizing it. So her interpretation is not marked with that mechanical sense, but rather exaggerated shape that she gives to the music, which fundamentally looks like it should just keep ticking along. She's able to produce the greatest contrast through which this quite threatening texture from the beginning actually sounds like a big relief. We know that the tempo is, because it's obviously moving now towards redemption, you can't be any worse than that concentrated sin. Even that ugly sound, the ugly actions that permeated both the gnome and the bouidla and the middle of Limoges, they come back here. It feels like a release. This quite harsh. And this time around, she keeps the tempo the same. No change in tempo like she did on that first page. So there's a sense of accomplishment and moving forward. And she carries that through, of course, into the last movement. Same tempo. Really strong arch through which she herself can then accommodate that word cycle. So I think I'm running out of time already for this, and so just to finish, just to say that I'm going to be very interested to keep working a little bit further on this material, not only with the Mussorgsky but other composers that she looked at, to see if there's more to that system. So I'm intrigued how it compares to her vision of Bach. I already have a few ideas, but I have a feeling that there's a lot more behind her eccentricity, and that in effect will be a far more valuable thing to understand performance practice of the time, how they put together literature and interdisciplinary art forms to form an interpretation, rather than to try and just chase exactly what happened in which bar in a one-off performance. So thank you very much, and I welcome any questions. Oh, sorry, I can't hear you.
It would be lovely. Thank you, Maria. It was incredibly rewarding to hear a presentation with music
Спасибо.
that you play yourself. So I think everybody will join me in congratulating with this. And I would like people to ask questions or comments and so on.
I have a question, but it's in the room next to me. So yeah.
Oh, please do.
Yeah, hi. I was honored to watch it live, in real life. So my question is really, I know because about your...
Who are you? Could you please introduce yourself?
Oh yeah, of course, sorry. I was the presenter in the previous session, so Maria Karelkova, University of Greenwich. But exactly, it's kind of connected to my presentation as well. because I know you're working on vast material of like female pianists, and this is really coming to current trend of revealing female signature, female kind of footprint in all cultural disciplines. And I can tell from my kind of media and film perspective that there are certain techniques that are kind of in the way female, for example, directors are redefined through kind of not being male directors, kind of is extrapolated through kind of social norms. So how women can understand more what's going on to their characters, to their heroines, and understanding more maybe about motherhood, maybe about bodies. So this is all a kind of very bodily connection to distinguish kind of, and obviously that's all been contested, like it's not all, like there's no final word there yet. But somehow kind of distilling those markers, like can we tell that there's female directors and these are male directors, which is the answer is no, but still there are attempts to do so. Are there similar attempts?
Dangerous conversation nowadays.
Yeah, well, and it's all political as well nowadays, but we are trying kind of to understand also, but politics is mostly, well, most of the time connected to aesthetics. So if there are any kind of broader kind of results that you have and looking into like female and in general, how do you distinguish that man's style, women's style in music, if you could? Yeah, so that's the broader question. Thank you.
So I know with someone like Yudina, she's in some ways you could say deliberately making a more masculine sound, being a bit more assertive in her playing. Probably not because she's trying to think male or female, but probably more likely because of the kind of preconception that some of her colleagues had about what she should be playing. So if we look at someone like Richter, he was very well known for playing Schubert, and there was a sense that he was allowed to be lyrical, and that was seen as lyrical Schubert is very hard to play. She played actually the same slow tempo that he was famous for, but if she played it in a lyrical way, she'd fall into the canon of a domesticated Schubert, which was quite obviously, I mean, the Soviet Union had a problem with someone like Schubert, right? That he symbolizes the domesticated sort of home goddess. And I don't think she wanted to fall into that, but I don't think it's because she was thinking I'm a female and Richter is male. I think it was just more that she found herself having to respond to the stereotype of homeliness in a performance in a way that for someone like Richter, who very quickly became famous internationally, he could make those decisions based on no one abroad has heard it done lyrically and slowly, so I'm going to do it that way, rather than linking it into the home Soviet aesthetics. So I think the main difference is actually that I'm finding is that the female pianists didn't obviously travel independently or if at all outside the Soviet Union, because they couldn't get visas, because they would be seen as people who wouldn't come back. So they have to confront the aesthetics in front of them, whereas the famous male musicians that are known, yes, they had difficulties with visas, but they had a lot more contact with the aesthetics of the outside in a direct way. She had correspondence with colleagues internationally, but it's not the same, right? So having a correspondence with them or actually living in a different set of aesthetic expectations.
So all comes actually from political and kind of
I think
social realities from being a woman at that time and what
I think it's all it becomes a very complicated web. It's very hard to decipher what starts it off, but I think lots of layers come into it. She never writes about herself as oh, I'm a female pianist and I've got small hands. She never uses this kind of language, but neither does Tatiana Nikolaeva, and neither does Rosa Tamarkin, and no one in the reviews says, oh, she's a woman, so she plays in this particular way. They get treated as equals inside the Soviet Union. I think the difference comes when you start to look at international reception.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Actually, picking up on this question, if somebody would, I want to ask you, but how many of a male pianist could get actually out of Soviet Union and travel besides Richter and possibly Gilles? I mean, so I would like to talk about two things giving personality. One of them, the image of femme fatale or femme exotique at the beginning of the century, I mean, to me, I was thinking about Zinaida Gippius, Isa Rubinstein, Ella Nazimova. They were all eccentric, heavily eccentric, barging into the men, women, whatever world there was. So maybe it would be interesting to befit her. I don't know the answer. I don't know, Yudina. Befit her with this category of women who were, yes.
Yes, no, no, that's what I'm planning. If I have the resources, that's where I was planning to take this, to try and create a more
Was actually at the break of the century, modernism was largely piloted or not, but at least was largely contributed by women in
yes.
all the field. I mean, I can go on and on with this, but so the other thing, I mean, you said that it's because of women she was not allowed in the abroad, but if she was bringing the pistol to the orchestra in the Soviet Union, I would imagine that nobody would let her go abroad, not because she's a woman, but because she has a pistol. Okay, so that was my comment and question about the befitting her with this category. And the other one is that is there I may be missing this. Was there recording of her Mussorgsky playing?
There is one recording. I'm inspired to look at, and I have taken this information to make these assumptions. I don't think one recording on its own made at 2 o'clock in the morning will ever be representative, which is why I'm not interested in the specifics of, okay, in this recording she did it like this, so she obviously always did it like this. She would have had the worst studio times and the worst equipment, literally, to make her recordings, because she wasn't in that rank of pianists who would have had the sort of the honors. What I'm more interested in what she says and what she marks in the score, and trying to have a general idea of the kind of touch she might mean by particular words. And for me, what is helpful is her actually intense love of poetry, and the idea that she quotes poetry so often, even through her recitals, and she quotes them through her lectures. That gives me a more vibrant idea, I hope, of how she sees or hears musical sound. So I think listening to a recording and just saying, okay, this is what she does, it gives you the sort of only scratches the surface of the information. It's only the first most basic layer that we can.
So basically, it's reconstructing the performance.
The spirit of the performance, rather than the performance of one performance itself. What I want to do is try and find out how these words actually manifest.
Who was she and what did she do? Right.
Well,
okay.
She was a
I
pianist.
don't want to occupy all the time. So
no, she was a pianist and pedagogue, but she was also heavily influenced, and she took a philosophy degree in Moscow. So she was very friendly with Batkin, and always interested in theology. And it's a very literary persona who, in my opinion, actually just happened to be a pianist and express her stuff through pianism. Rather than the other way around. Of course, she had formal training as a pianist, and that was her career. But in my sense of who she is she's a thinker who then expresses that tension of what she sees in the world through this kind of sound, rather than the verbalized sound.
When you talk about theology, are you talking about religion or just a sense of spiritual?
She got more and more religious throughout her life. Initially,
what's the religion of hers?
She was born Jewish, and she converted very early into Russian Orthodox.
So it's very interesting persona.
Very, very interesting.
I'm going to give somebody else opportunity to speak. Please.
If I may ask my question. So this is just like a broad, this is a broad question only because I'm not familiar with Maria Yudina. But I do know that they've been a few documentaries, so I've seen her name previous places, but I'm curious how you've considered the music context dialectic, only because so many of the talks during this conference have been putting the context first, and you're putting the music first. So I'm curious how you're thinking about the contextual surroundings of her performance practice. She decides to have like an exaggerated dynamic contrast. What kind of the social let's say the social fabric, where is she pulling that from? Because obviously that's not coming from nowhere, and that's not just being pulled.
Yeah, well, I have the benefit of having done a pretty big study on Heinrich Neuhaus, who would have known her playing and who had a similar circle to hers. And through that study, what I could see already is that what they tended to do within this sort of, I'm going to broadly call it a circle, I mean, they didn't always get on. They seemed to need to latch onto an image through which to build a musical shape. So it's like the actual music itself is actually clothing a scaffold of some kind of, I don't know whether you want to call it spiritual or you want to call it a poetic image. So the score itself becomes of secondary importance to them. They're much more concerned that they've grabbed onto some symbol and that this music itself can fit around that symbol and make sense to them in their own world. And it almost, for them, because they're operating in a, I mean, they're out in the open, they're not censored or anything like this. This is all happening on the big concert stages, but it's definitely not fitting into the dynamic of the time of socialist realism and the aesthetics of socialist realism. This is really Silver Age ideas about what music and transformation of the musical idea and the soul is. So it's a very belated kind of phenomenon that is occurring. I mean, the Silver Age is over by the 20s officially, but this is happening throughout the 20th century through this group of musicians. And that is what fascinates me, is that, you know, they're not thinking in terms of a concrete answer, yes, no, definite. What they're thinking of is some kind of experiential approach to art. So the feeling and sharing of a symbol within that group is validated by the music rather than the other way around. It's not trying to find something that explains the music. It's trying to fit the music onto something else that they want to communicate. And I think that's a fascinating way to go around playing music, right? It liberates you from the sense of this pedestal composer who had the right answer and we just have to do what he did and then we'll be fine. This is totally the opposite. It's about, I want to communicate something that I can't really say out loud because I don't have the words or the means to do it, but through this common symbol we will be able to try and get that thread flowing. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, just a correlate, just very quick, I apologize. Could a performance practice like hers, like you had mentioned that her desire to record her performance practice came from some sort of, initial response of some kind. Could her style of performance practice, this very kind of philosophical idea, exist before the Soviet culture, but after the end of the Soviet Union? You mentioned, heavy symbolistic understructure. Does that exist today? And do you know any pianists that kind of echo her?
Well, she during the Soviet Union, she didn't have very much. This is why this all happened in the Salon. She was effectively barred after Stalin's death, actually, not before, from performing on the big stages. So her, despite her in the film killing Stalin, her grief really started when he died, rather than the other way around.
It is interesting, if I may add, that most of the name that I mentioned, Gipios, Nazimova, I mean, they all departed. Ustvolskaya was lost and she's a later generation. So she's the single figure who's stuck in the Soviet Russia, okay?
Yeah.
Maria, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I would like you to, when you do that, you don't really say what it was. You just kind of suspect that it could be, right? Yes?
What she's doing, you mean?
Yes.
Well, it's...
Yes, but it's great. It's wonderful because
it's subjective, of course. It's my real...
Yes, yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So we have 10 minutes break.